They watched humanity from a distance, measuring every detail with precision, analyzing flesh and bone as if strength could be weighed on scales. To them, power had always been visible. Claws that tore through metal, hides that resisted blades, carapaces that turned fire into harmless warmth. They saw themselves reflected in the hard armor of other species, and when they looked at humans, all they saw was softness. Skin that tore with a scratch, organs exposed behind thin ribs, bodies vulnerable to heat, cold, disease, and decay. Reports filled their archives describing mankind as frail, biologically inefficient, a creature that somehow stumbled into space travel by accident. On their worlds, endurance meant unbroken shells, chemical immunity, brute power. Humanity, in comparison, looked like a candle flame flickering in a storm. Alien scholars wrote assessments filled with ridicule. They noted the frequency of broken bones, the weakness of unprotected skulls, the shortness of lifespans compared to silicon-based species whose bodies lasted centuries. They laughed at the human reliance on medicine, the constant battle against sickness, the fragile balance required for survival. Even their emotions were considered liabilities, mood swings that made them unpredictable and irrational. The consensus was simple. If strength was measured by body alone, humans ranked among the lowest of spacefaring life. Fragility defined them. Yet fragility did not tell the full story, and hidden within every human life was a record of survival that their observers failed to recognize. On Earth, existence had never been easy. They grew up in landscapes of deserts that burned skin, mountains that froze blood, and oceans that swallowed ships without hesitation. Humanity endured plagues that wiped out millions, wars that scarred continents, famines that tested entire generations. They rebuilt after fire, after flood, after disaster upon disaster, each time carrying scars yet refusing to vanish. Every child was born into a world that demanded adaptation, and somehow, despite the endless threats, humanity spread further instead of retreating. They lived not because their bodies were strong, but because their will refused collapse. The first encounter was meant to be a controlled demonstration, a moment in which aliens would confirm their theories by direct observation. Humans were invited aboard a neutral vessel under the guise of cooperation, tested in environments calibrated to expose weakness. Artificial climates shifted from extreme heat to biting cold, oxygen levels were reduced, tasks were assigned beyond the capacity of unarmored flesh. The expectation was collapse. They waited for panic, for begging, for surrender. What they found unsettled them. One man, drenched in sweat, laughed at the sweltering heat and began telling stories of summers on Earth, of deserts that stretched farther than sight and still bred life. Another, teeth chattering in the cold, spoke calmly of winters where lakes turned to solid glass, and people still worked the fields, still walked to markets, still lived their lives as if frostbite was an inconvenience. Tasks were met not with resignation but with creativity. When a tool broke, hands improvised. When resources dwindled, they shared and rationed without command. When fear should have silenced them, they sang, voices carrying through the sterile halls like sparks against darkness. Alien observers exchanged uneasy glances. Resilience was not supposed to look like this. By every biological metric, humanity was still fragile, yet the evidence unfolding before their eyes contradicted weakness. It was not bone density that carried them through. It was something unmeasured, something no scanner could quantify. They endured because surrender never entered their calculations. Some scientists dismissed these early results as anomalies. Perhaps the humans chosen were unusually hardy specimens, representatives selected to distort reality. Perhaps the behavior was temporary bravado that would collapse under extended trials. Doubt remained, but unease spread in whispers. Even among themselves, the aliens questioned whether they had miscalculated. They had underestimated species before, but none had surprised them in this manner. Humans were not displaying hidden strength of body, but strength of will, a variable far more unpredictable than claws or armor. The testing continued, pushing deeper into conditions meant to reveal fragility. Hunger was introduced, and humans responded not with desperation, but with patience, organizing meager supplies so none were abandoned. Exhaustion was inflicted, yet when bodies faltered, others carried the burden without complaint. Pain was inflicted through subtle methods, and though they grimaced, though they cried, though their bodies bent, they did not beg for it to end. Some even joked through suffering, using humor as a shield that baffled alien minds. It was unnatural to them, a contradiction of logic. Pain was supposed to silence, yet humans turned it into camaraderie. One alien commander recorded privately, noting with unease that humans behaved as though fragility itself had trained them for survival. Where armored species never faced true vulnerability, humans had lived with it every moment of existence. Every cut risked infection, every storm risked death, every breath carried invisible threats. To live at all, they had adapted not through body, but through mentality. They had normalized hardship until it became another part of life. What other species considered unbearable, humanity considered ordinary. Still, the consensus among leadership was unchanged. Yes, humans were surprising. Yes, they adapted quickly. But strength, they argued, was still measurable in raw capacity. Their endurance was curious, but ultimately it was a soft strength, a fleeting quality that would break under prolonged exposure. Plans moved forward to escalate conditions, to strip away every advantage until humanity showed its true weakness. This was not cruelty in their eyes, but necessity, for only by measuring limits could they confirm theories. Humanity would falter, they believed, because fragility was undeniable. The humans, for their part, did not know the full extent of the judgment hanging over them. They sensed condescension, felt the weight of being underestimated, but they were too occupied with the present to consider the larger analysis. For them, every trial was simply another obstacle, and obstacles were nothing new. They approached tasks as they had approached every challenge in their history, together, with a mixture of stubbornness, creativity, and unshakable determination. They had no awareness that their behavior unsettled their observers, that their endurance was reshaping perception step by step. It was during one particularly grueling assessment, a simulation of barren wastelands with scarce resources, that the first seeds of doubt took firmer root among alien ranks. They had expected collapse within hours. Instead, humans organized into small groups, assigned roles, conserved energy, and treated survival as strategy rather than torment. Days stretched into longer periods, and though weakened, they did not fall. When one collapsed from exhaustion, others carried him. When thirst clawed at their throats, they improvised ways to extract moisture from the environment, recalling knowledge passed down from their deserts. Their survival was not graceful, but it was survival nonetheless, and survival was victory. By the end of these initial encounters, the narrative had shifted. No longer were they merely testing fragile beings. They were observing anomalies that challenged their definitions of strength. Reports once filled with mockery now carried tones of curiosity and caution, yet official stances remained unchanged. Humanity was still cataloged as fragile, still ranked low in raw capacity. What differed now was the acknowledgement that fragility did not equal failure. Beneath the surface, some began to wonder whether fragility itself was the source of their endurance. For every scar, every weakness, every vulnerability they carried, humanity had learned to overcome, and in overcoming, they had built something no scanner could quantify: resilience woven into their very identity. The observers prepared for harsher tests, confident that truth would emerge with greater pressure. But in private, in whispered conversations, in unrecorded notes, more and more voices admitted an unsettling thought. Perhaps they had not discovered humanity's weakness at all. Perhaps they had stumbled upon a different kind of strength, one not written in bone or blood, but in something invisible, something terrifyingly persistent. Perhaps fragility was not the weakness they had assumed, but the foundation of survival itself. When the initial experiments had reached their peak, and the reports began to fill with caution and disbelief, the alien leadership decided that the tests had not yet gone far enough. If they truly wished to understand the fragile species called humans, then they needed more than isolated trials. They needed to see the species under sustained pressure in groups without outside assistance. The hypothesis was clear. Once resources thinned, once fear overtook reason, humans would scatter like brittle shards of glass, each turning against the other in the fight for survival. But that was not what happened. When humans were left stranded in hostile environments with no external aid, they did not dissolve into chaos. Instead, they clustered together with an instinct so ancient it was carved into their bones. They divided roles with silent efficiency. Some searched for food, others for shelter, others worked on fire, tools, or water. Fear did not fracture them, it welded them tighter. The aliens were confounded. According to all precedent, fear was a solvent, not a glue. Yet here were creatures who turned dread into cohesion. They seemed to understand, almost instinctively, that alone they would fall, but together they had a chance. As the trials extended, the hidden dimensions of humanity began to surface. The aliens watched through their instruments as groups of humans fought fatigue not merely with strength, but with stories. One would recount wars fought centuries ago. Another spoke of ancestors who had crossed oceans or endured plagues. Another simply told myths of monsters vanquished by cleverness. The words themselves carried no physical nourishment, yet the listeners straightened, shoulders lifting, breath deepening. It was as though the stories themselves stitched torn willpower back together. Others made music, humming or drumming on makeshift instruments, turning silence into rhythm. Some prayed, speaking words the aliens could not decipher, but whose effect was undeniable. Morale rose, eyes sharpened, hands steadied. And then there was laughter, sharp, unrestrained, rolling through the night as if mocking despair itself. To the aliens, silence was survival. To humans, sound was defiance. The scientists began to ask questions they had not asked before. If humans were fragile, why did their hearts seem so unbreakable? If their bodies surrendered easily to injury, why did their minds claw back against inevitability? The contradictions grew louder with each passing cycle. The trials escalated. Hunger was extended. Sleep was denied. Conditions designed to erode reason and civility were imposed. Other species had failed at this stage. Intelligence collapsed into madness. Cooperation dissolved into violence. Yet humanity did not collapse. They staggered, they faltered, but even in weakness they reached for one another. A weary man would prop up the wounded. A sleepless mother would soothe a crying stranger's child. The aliens recorded acts that could not be explained by evolutionary selfishness alone. These were not mere survival strategies. These were choices. Conscious, deliberate sacrifices for the sake of another. And in that realization, a shadow of unease crept into the alien observers. Strength, as they had always measured it, was a matter of claws, armor, venom, and muscle. But here, laid bare before them, was another kind of strength, an invisible one. The strength to endure when reason says give up. The strength to sacrifice for one who offers no immediate return. The strength to create meaning in the face of senseless suffering. Then came disease. New pathogens were engineered and released into the human test groups. The aliens fully expected collapse. No species had endured their crafted plagues. Yet once again, the humans confounded them. Lacking advanced medicine, they improvised. They boiled water, they experimented with herbs, they adapted their diets. And even when cures failed, they refused to abandon the afflicted. One human, fevered and coughing, would be watched over by another who sang softly until dawn. Sometimes the sick died, but they did not die alone, and the living carried on with renewed determination, as though grief itself had been reforged into resolve. The reports became unsettling. Analysts who once wrote of weakness now struggled with vocabulary. Words like resilience, unity, defiance crept into the language of the files. For the first time, the alien scientists found themselves staring not at data, but at questions of philosophy. Was fragility truly the right word for a species that would face certain death, yet still whisper encouragement to another? Was weakness the right word for beings who turned suffering into stories, despair into laughter, and fear into solidarity? The longer the trials continued, the more obvious the truth became. Humanity's strength was not in their brittle bodies, but in their refusal to surrender. When cornered by despair, they built hope. When crushed by loss, they found each other. When threatened by annihilation, they adapted, endured, and rose again. The aliens had set out to measure survival. What they discovered instead was something deeper: meaning. Humanity did not merely endure, they endured for the friend beside them, for the story to be told, for the future to exist, even if they would not see it. That "for" was a force no equation could contain. And with that, unease turned into something else, a quiet fear. The decision to end the trials should have come easily. The aliens had gathered more data than they had ever thought possible, but still, they pushed for one final measure. It was not enough to observe humans under pressure. They wanted to see them pushed into inevitability, placed in situations where hope itself was mathematically absent. For them, inevitability was the edge of existence. When the equation had no solution, when escape was impossible, all other species surrendered to despair. If humans were as fragile as first believed, then this would be the final proof. Yet, once again, what they saw defied expectation. A group of humans was placed in a sealed environment where the conditions were engineered to decline at a steady rate, oxygen levels dropping, temperatures plummeting, resources exhausted. It was a chamber of doom with no door, a trap with no exit. The outcome was predetermined, but the behavior of the humans within was not. The aliens prepared for chaos, fighting over air, clawing for scraps of warmth, a desperate spiral into savagery. What unfolded instead made even the most detached observers fall silent. The humans did not waste their last breaths on panic. They organized, speaking softly so that each word would conserve energy. They shared warmth, bodies pressed together, the stronger shielding the weaker. They rationed oxygen by turn, one sleeping lightly while another stayed awake. And as the air thinned, they spoke not of fear, but of memory. Childhood summers, faces of loved ones, futures they would never see but still imagined. They painted hope with words even when the future had been mathematically erased. And in those final moments, when other species would have dissolved into mindless terror, the humans created meaning. One sang a lullaby to another. One whispered a prayer. Another pressed a simple "thank you" into the silence, gratitude given when nothing remained to give. Their bodies failed, but their dignity remained unbroken. The aliens turned away, unable to watch, unsettled by the realization that fragility could house something indestructible. This pattern repeated across trial after trial. When confronted with inescapable storms, humans built shelters together until the last possible moment. When dropped into lifeless wastelands, they carved symbols into stone, as though declaring, "We were here and that mattered." When set against predators they could not defeat, they distracted the beasts so that others could flee, accepting death so that the group might endure. Each time, the aliens saw a refusal to collapse, even when collapse was inevitable. Humanity had a way of transcending survival by finding reasons to face extinction with purpose. That purpose was the mystery that disturbed the scientists most. What calculation explained why a human would give their last portion of food to another? What logic drove them to sing when silence might have prolonged survival? What equation justified dying for a stranger? The numbers did not fit. What they were witnessing was not simply survival instinct, it was something greater, something invisible and yet undeniably real. And slowly the reports changed tone. They no longer described humans as fragile. Instead, words like unyielding, incomprehensible, and defiant crept into the analysis. Some alien researchers began to confess admiration, though quietly, as if admitting weakness. Others grew uneasy, whispering that a species capable of enduring the impossible was not to be studied like an insect, but to be respected like a force of nature. The paradigm was shifting, and no amount of denial could halt it. It was then that the higher councils intervened. They had reviewed the data and saw not frailty but danger. A species that refused to surrender even when crushed could not be dismissed as weak. Fragility was not the correct description. Unpredictability was. They were not dealing with glass but with fire. Break a fragment of glass and it is gone forever. Strike at fire and it spreads. Humanity was not brittle. They were contagious, carrying endurance like a spark that leapt from one to another until an entire group blazed with defiance. The councils argued over what must be done. Some called for extermination before the spark spread beyond control. Others argued for isolation, to observe from a distance. But a smaller, quieter voice began to suggest something radical. Perhaps humanity was not a threat to be removed but a mystery to be embraced, a teacher rather than an enemy. For the first time in recorded memory, the councils of a galactic power hesitated, uncertain, because a so-called fragile species had shown them a mirror they did not expect. And while the councils debated, the humans, unaware of the storm above them, continued to live as they always had, enduring, adapting, creating, dreaming. It was in their nature not to wait for judgment, but to carve their own meaning into the universe, no matter who watched. The councils had hoped that distance would cool the unease, that time would let them study the anomaly of humanity without feeling its weight. Yet time brought no comfort. The more they reviewed the archives of human behavior, the more contradictions they unearthed. Humanity bled and suffered, yes, but they also rebuilt from ruin with a speed that was unmatched. They grieved in one breath and in the next dared to dream of futures impossible. Fragile was the wrong word. If they were fragile, then fragility had been redefined into something unbreakable. The final trial was never intended to be public. It was designed as a closed observation, a quiet test that would not echo beyond the laboratories. Yet when the experiment unfolded, word spread through the networks like fire through dry fields. Every layer of their civilization heard the same whispers. The fragile ones had endured again. This time it was not survival by chance, but survival by choice. The humans had been given an option to betray, to sacrifice one another for the possibility of escape, and yet they refused. They chose unity over self-preservation, and in doing so they baffled every law the councils had trusted. The aliens, for all their technology and logic, had believed survival was the highest law. Yet here was a species that placed something higher. Humans protected the weak when it endangered themselves. They chose hope when despair was the rational outcome. They carried memories like shields, laughed in the face of suffering, and refused to give their dignity to the void. And it was not only once. It was a pattern repeating itself until it could no longer be dismissed as anomaly. It was their nature. The debates grew louder. Was such a species dangerous or divine? To study them was to confront questions that shook the foundations of alien philosophy. How could one dominate a creature that would not bend? How could one enslave a being that found freedom even in chains? Their resilience was not in the body but in the mind, and the mind could not be contained by force. One counselor spoke what others feared to admit. If ever humanity spread beyond their small world, their influence would ripple like waves across stone. Not through power but through example. They would not conquer, they would inspire. That thought terrified many. A weapon you can fight, a disease you can cure, but an idea infects without consent, spreads without control, and cannot be destroyed without becoming stronger. Humanity was such an idea. Their existence itself was a challenge. That fragility was not weakness, that mortality was not defeat, that suffering could forge something beyond comprehension. To accept humanity was to admit the limits of their own civilizations. To destroy them was to reveal fear. The councils hesitated at this crossroads, trapped by the very paradox they had uncovered. Meanwhile, the humans remained unaware of the storm above. They lived as they always had, bound to struggle, rising from ruins, carving meaning into every day. Their children dreamed of stars, their poets wrote of infinity, their scientists chased mysteries. None of them knew that their quiet acts of endurance were watched by civilizations who trembled at the sight. They were not warriors in this story, they were simply themselves, and that was enough to shake empires. It was in that moment that a decision formed, not in the chambers of power, but in the minds of ordinary alien observers. Soldiers who had watched humans stand unflinching before death. Scholars who had studied their resilience and found themselves changed. Even oppressors who once sneered at their fragility now carried doubt like a splinter in the heart. The shift was subtle but unstoppable. The fragile ones had seeded something in them, a recognition of what endurance truly meant. The councils called for silence, for containment of the reports, but it was too late. Ideas cannot be caged. Word of humanity spread not as threat but as wonder. They survived everything. They endured everything. They broke every equation of inevitability. And because of that, civilizations began to question themselves. If a fragile species could stare into annihilation and still sing, what excuse did the powerful have for cowardice? If a mortal species could sacrifice for love, what excuse did the immortal have for selfishness? Humanity, by their mere existence, had demanded better from the galaxy. In time, the aliens faced the truth they had never wanted to admit. Humanity did not need to conquer to shape destiny. Their story, whispered in shadows and echoed in chambers, had already begun to rewrite the laws of survival. For in the face of the void, when logic declared all was lost, the fragile ones endured. And endurance, they realized, was not weakness. It was the most powerful weapon of all.